YouTubers, and welcome to this new video. Forget your SNES versus Mega Drive or NES versus Master System wars. The original computer war, at least here in the UK, was between the ZX Spectrum and the C64. And I was stuck smack bang in the middle of this war. We originally had a Spectrum in our home. My brother got a Spectrum. Well, he got the ZX81 before that, but the Spectrum. A few years later, I was to get the C64. And then the wars began over which was better, which looked better, which played better, which had the best games, which had the best graphics, etc, etc, etc. And that was good. That war was raging on in the school grounds, with my friends as well. It was a massive computer wars, and in the actual magazines of the times, between Zap magazine for the 64, Zap 64, and the Crash or Sinclair user for the Spectrum, massive gaming wars. Both these computers have their advantages and disadvantages. I'm lucky now to own both of them, and I'm absolutely thrilled to own both of them and to play them both now. In this video, I'm going to look at each computer separately, go through its advantages and disadvantages, so the Spectrum first and then the 64, and then we'll come back and conclude and see if we can finally put an end to this computer war once and for all. So the ZX Spectrum, probably the most iconic UK home computer ever. Excuse the noise, I've got Horace Goes Skiing, which is that game there, playing in the background, and the noise is actually coming from the Spectrum itself, so I can't lower that, but we can work through that. This was released in 1982, and I think my brother actually had it. Well, he actually got it bought for him in about 1982 or 1983 at the latest. But it was right at the start of the Spectrum launch. It originally launched as a 16K machine. This is the 48K version, which came out soon afterwards. And probably the most popular version is the 48K Spectrum, which is this one here. Now, when you got the computer, so when you bought the computer, forget that tape deck. The only thing you would get is the computer, a power supply. I think you might have got the RF lead, which leads from the computer to the TV so you can get a picture. And that was it. That was all you got. Now, in the early 80s, a lot of families, and we certainly did, had a few of these tape deck units. These were very popular at the time. It was the time before the Walkman really caught on. But these were in pretty much every household, or certainly every UK household at the time. You would need one of these to load games onto this. It's pretty much the only way you could do it at the time. But you didn't get that. Unlike the C64, which had its dedicated dataset unit, you didn't get this as part of the package. You just got basically this. And if we take a look around the machine, obviously you've got the RF lead, which leads to the TV to get a picture, the era mic, which attaches to your cassette player so that you could load games, and the power supply, and you've got a serial port at the back there. You can just about see it there. You will notice a lack of a joystick port. It's really bleeping away. I love Horace Goes Skiing. Very iconic game. I'll show you a bit of that in a moment. But the lack of a joystick port. That was because Sir Clive Sinclair, the creator, the producer, the actual person who produced these computers, didn't want this to be a games machine. It didn't really, that wasn't his inspiration for the machine or inspiration for making it. The same for Commodore as well. This was meant for educational purposes. educational purposes and business purposes, or business uses. It was never meant to be a games machine. It was just that when the actual public got hold of it, they could see the potential for games, and of course, that's now history. It became an iconic games machine, but that was never the intent. Now, you at the time, around not so long after the Spectrum launch, you could buy a cartridge, kind of cartridge thing that would plug in the back there in the serial port, and then in that cartridge you could plug a joystick, so you could use a joystick to play games. I can pick them up cheaply now off eBay, but I purposely haven't bought one because I love these rubber keys. Oh, I think I've just started the game. I love the textile feel of these rubber keys. I can't remember which way you are, that's it. So, in this case, IMP, control this. I won't play the game yet, but it feels like a giant gamepad. The keys have such a unique feel to them. Really unique feel to them. Out of all the 8-bit computers, these keys are probably some of the most iconic, or the keyboard's probably the most iconic keyboard ever. But it just feels like a giant gamepad. It's just brilliant to play with the keyboard. And that's the way my brother first played it when he got his Spectrum. And that's the way I played it when I played on this Spectrum. And it's just such a good feeling to play with that keyboard. It feels, like I say, like a giant gamepad. But if you wanted, you could buy that cartridge extension, cartridge thing, joystick cartridge thing, which you could, I think it's called the Kempston cartridge, or expander, or something of that sort. And then you could plug a joystick in and play games. It was just far more satisfying to use a keyboard. Now let's talk about the sound. You can hear part of the sound there. Could be said to be one of the main disadvantages of the Spectrum, of the original Spectrums at least, that the sound wasn't really up to much cop. Retrospectively, looking at it now and playing it now, it's absolutely iconic. This beeps and bops you get from that sound, very basic sounds, but it feels so retro, so unique. And really only the Spectrum sounds like this. Another one of the most iconic sounds of the Spectrum is the loading sound. I'm going to show you a quick example of that now. So yeah, when people think of retro 8-bit computers, often that loading sound, that loading noise would come into their heads. And in fact, many YouTubers use it as their sort of front end or introduction to their videos. Such an iconic sound. And that's why I haven't yet bought a sort of SD expansion. You can buy now, like the Commodore 64, an SD card reader where you can store all your games, but then you won't get that iconic loading sound. I love that. Another big disadvantage, and this goes with the Commodore 64 as well, is that loading from tape is very finicky. Never perfect. You would have to lower or increase or decrease the volume sometimes, mess around with your tape recorder, tape player to get the games loaded. Took me probably up to 10 attempts today to load this game. Yeah, we're talking about games now which are almost... Actually, Horace Goes Skiing, I think it's 1982 or 1983. It's coming on to be 40 years old now. And this is the original cassettes. All these are the original cassettes. So of course it's going to be more difficult now than it was in the day of the Spectrum when it was released. But still, even going back those days, you could be loading a game, you could have 10 attempts easily at trying to load a game. In fact, I got a couple of games through the post recently. Most of them work okay. What was it? I got Trashman, or Amiga Run, a couple of others, Star Strike, fantastic. I'll come to that in a moment too. And Silkworm, another fantastic. That was a more recent, one of the later releases on the Spectrum. But all fantastic games. But this I cannot get to load. I've almost got it to load. I'll just have to keep playing with the volume on this and keep messing around to try and get it to load. I'm determined to get that to load. I really want to play Trashman. But those are the pains you would go through with the Spectrum. And often, I'll come on to it later, but the C64 had similar problems. But specifically, I found trying to load Spectrum games, and I remember the ZX81 games before that, it could be very painful, and you would have to wait a few minutes at least for a game to load, and if it crashed or didn't load partway through, you would have to start again. Disadvantage of both machines, so I can't just blame that on the Spectrum, but I think specifically I remember the pains on the Spectrum. Another disadvantage you could say on the Spectrum is the colour clash. Not much colour clash in this specific game. I'll just move you can see my character on top there moving left and right. I can't remember the keys to move up and down. Oh, yeah, Z and A, I think, to move up and down. Okay, difficult to play one-handed. Just giving you an idea of how it plays. In this game, there's not much colour clash. In other games, there will be a lot of colour clash, and that would happen when two colours hit each other, or two objects hit each other, or your character hit. Let's try and get it working now. I think there is a bit of colour clash in here. Yeah, you can see that little bit of colour clash, tiny bit. It could get quite extreme in some games, and that you could call it's more an iconic feature now, but a disadvantage of the time. Another disadvantage is that there weren't that many colours, and this is pretty representable of how games would look on the Spectrum. Not a great deal of colours on screen. Lots and lots of sprites though, and actually lots of fast-moving sprites. One of the advantages of the Spectrum was actually in games like Flight Simulator, 3D Star Strike especially, when you got vector graphics moving on screen, they could move incredibly quickly. Let me show you a couple of examples of that now. So there you go, you could see how quickly those graphics were moving. On the Commodore 64, you'd be lucky to get maybe 1 or 2 frames a second sometimes on those type of games. I was immensely jealous when my brother showed me 3D Star Strike. There was nothing like it at that speed on the 64. Massive advantage for the Spectrum. And Flight Simulator as well, I played that recently. I didn't play it back in the day, but that moves bloody quickly on the Spectrum compared to incredibly and painfully slowly on the C64. I'll go back to it again, but the sound. Some games had slightly better sound than this, but this is pretty representable of how Spectrum games would sound. No real music. Later models you would get sound. I think 128 onwards, the Spectrum 128 onwards, so later models you would get fairly decent sound and music. But other than that, you would get a few beeps and blops. Absolutely iconic now. Back in the day, no. I mean, I'll come on to it later with the C64, but it's like chalk and cheese in terms of sound capabilities. Another major advantage for the Spectrum are actually the detail of the graphics. This is a very early game, so you're not going to get much detail showing in this game. But let me show you examples of a few games that had incredible details in the sprites and the graphics. And indeed, retrospectively, looking back and playing some of these classic games now, seeing some of the graphics and seeing how quickly and how many sprites you can get on screen, it's actually pretty incredible. And it's really, really playable. I'm having loads of fun playing the Spectrum games now that I didn't play back in the day. I played some of them, but reliving some memories and playing games that I hadn't played, having a real blast. Very, very playable games. With the price point and the fact that it was one of the first main sort of 8-bit computers that had good gaming potential to release in the UK, I could see why this is so popular. I can see why it's so loved by so many people today. I love it. Wasn't my go-to computer, the C64 was, but I love this now. Absolutely love it. Iconic machine. Absolutely brilliant. And yeah, like I say, you could see why it's so popular. So that's the Spectrum. Let's now move on to the C64. And so we come on to the mighty C64. It was released around the same time. Pardon me, I've got Paperboy playing in the background. I'll come to that in a moment. Good thing about this is I can lower the volume because it's on TV. Released around the same time, 1982. I don't believe this became popular in the UK and Europe till a couple of years later. You're looking maybe 1983-4 when it really started to take off. I got mine in 1985, in fact, and by that time there were a load of great games already available. Between sort of 1984 and late 80s, same for the Spectrum, there's some incredible games released in those mid-80s, so I got mine, I would say, at about the right time. Unlike the Spectrum, at least here in Europe and the UK, it came with its own dataset unit. It's like a dedicated tape player for the C64, so it came with that in the UK, at least in Europe. But you were paying a bit more than you would for the Spectrum. I believe this release initially released for £399, and later it was lowered to £300. I think mine cost £300 by the time I got it. I got it as a Christmas present. That's compared to the Spectrum, released at £125. Later it was reduced to £100. So you were paying a premium for this, but many would say it's well worth it. Taking a look around the C64, you can see on the side there, straight off, unlike the Spectrum, you've got a couple of joystick ports. This was released predominantly as a business machine. It's in the title of the company, in fact, Commodore Business Machines. This was aimed at the business market. I've got a sneaking suspicion that they hedged their bets a bit, because not only do you have two joystick ports, but you have an incredible sound chip and some incredible gaming features built into the chipset. I'll come to that later. Two joystick ports on the side, you could use mice with them as well, of course, for business applications. At the back, various different, let's just lift this up a little bit without breaking it. Various different ports, printer ports, tape ports. A bit more a cartridge port. There was a bit more expansion, a few more versatility, a lot more versatility in the ports of the C64 than Spectrum. But again, remember, you were paying a premium for this. You were paying quite a bit more than you would for the Spectrum. So let's get to some of the advantages of the C64 over pretty much any other 8-bit computers at the time. It was this incredible sound chip. I'm running Paperboy at the moment because this was one of the first games that really I saw and played, and it blew my mind. It's just like, how can I describe it? Like a razzmatazz, like bling that you wouldn't get. Certainly not in a Spectrum. The colours popped, the sound popped. When you got into the game, by the way, this is the Boomerang joystick. It's a newer type joystick gamepad that you can use with the C64. I'll link you my review in the top right. When you got into the games, I'll do this one-handed. Is it going to play? Yep. Let me just show you. So I'm doing this one-handed effectively. Again, but you can see how smooth that scrolling is. One of the main advantages of the C64 over 8-bit computers was the scrolling. Not only up and down, so portrait, but from horizontal scrolling as well. Incredible gaming capabilities. You can see the colours are bright and vibrant. The scrolling was fantastic, and the sound was incredible. It just made for some incredible arcade games and other type of games. Like I say, a lot of razzmatazz and bling that you certainly wouldn't get on the Spectrum. One of the disadvantages, you could say, let's start that game again. If you look at the graphics, they actually look fairly blocky. This is quite typical of C64 games. Fairly blocky graphics compared to the Spectrum. Spectrum certainly had an advantage in its detail of the graphics and sprites. Also, you can get a lot more sprites on screen without slowdown on the Spectrum as well. So the Spectrum certainly had the upper hand in the detail of the graphics and the amount of sprites you can get on screen. There you go, just let that finish. But like I say, it's that razzmatazz. Another disadvantage, let's go over another disadvantage of the C64, are the vector graphics. I'm going to show you a couple of games of how typical games of vector graphics on the C64, so you can get an idea on how slowly those ran. So there you go, typically not the best in terms of vector graphics. The Spectrum definitely had the upper hand there. I wish I played more of the Spectrum at the time. I was so addicted to this, though, so happy when I got this that I didn't look back. Even my brother was showing me some Spectrum games. Yeah, the Star Wars type game that I showed you in that Spectrum, the speed of that did blow my mind. I wish we had something like that on the C64. Once I got this, I just didn't look back. And that's where I stand. Because of all that bling, that excitement, the sound capabilities, the scrolling capabilities, the way the colourful graphics move on the screen, I didn't mind that bit of blockiness. None of us did. I paid a lot of money to get this refurbished, this C64. Bought it off eBay, paid quite a lot of money, bought a new power supply, sent it off to get all the sort of capacitors recapped and the sort of a makeover for the C64 to get it up and running and hopefully to preserve it. I did that for a reason. I'm in love not only with C64 games, but it's the sound. There's a program on a 64. I use my SD to IEC. It's like a little SD card reader for the C64. And I load a program called SID Player, and I will sit for hours listening to SID tunes, different SID tunes, over and over. It's one of my fondest memories, probably one of most people's fondest memories of the C64 was the sound and the music. There simply has been nothing like it since. Certainly nothing like it at the time. The razzmatazz, the excitement of the game, just the whole bling. For me, it just had that edge over the Spectrum. But hey, like I said, I'm a bit biased. It's my favourite computer of all time. And it's the computer that I had at home. So let's take you to the conclusion now. So there you go. Have we come to the final conclusion, the final solution over which is better, the Spectrum or C64? Honestly, no, we haven't. I got the C64 purposely. I purposely bought it. I wanted it. I got it repaired, spent quite a lot of money on getting it refurbished. Spectrum came to me accidentally. I got it from an accounting client as part payment for my services. Absolutely thrilled I got it when I started to play it in the modern day, so recently. Some of the exclusive games are fantastic. You do have games that were released on both systems, the same game released on both systems, but some of the exclusive games that you got on the Spectrum were absolutely brilliant and fantastic to play. It's chalk and cheese. They both play very differently. They both look very different in the graphics in the games, and they both absolutely sound very different. For me, this will always be my favourite computer of all time. I've mentioned already, but the games slightly edge it for me, slightly better the Spectrum for me. The razzmatazz of them, the excitement, the whole feel, the whole package of the games, the sound, the graphics, the scrolling and whatever, it just slightly edges out. But that's the computer I owned. I am slightly biased. Retrospectively, looking back on this and playing this, the nostalgic feel when you're playing these games, Spectrum, I probably get more nostalgia from that, the Spectrum, than I do from the C64. If this was your main computer as well, you're obviously going to be biased towards this. And I think, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it to you now in the comments. What's your favourite computer? Which do you feel is best? Put your arguments down in the comments. Put your thoughts and memories. I'd love to hear them in the comments as well. We're never going to solve this computer war. It's a glorious computer war. I do find computer wars generally and consoles wars a bit silly. Basically, you know, you have one or the other and you enjoy it. If you enjoy it, you enjoy it. You don't need to boast over which is best. Although I did my fair bit of boasting when I had the 64, but it was a bit of fun. Put your comments down below. I'd appreciate a like, and I would really appreciate if you subscribed as well, because it simply does. People ask for subscriptions because it helps them helps me, certainly encourages me to make more videos. The more likes, the more comments it gets, the more I just want to make more videos. So leave your comments below, and yeah, I'll be interested to hear what you have to say.